The German officers were confident, too confident. It was December 1941, and they stood near their silent tanks, staring at engines that refused to wake up. The night had crushed everything under a layer of ice, the temperature falling below -30 degrees Celsius. Metal screamed when touched. Oil turned into thick sludge. Batteries died before dawn. Orders were clear. Advance east, crush what remained of the Soviet resistance. But nothing moved. Not the Panzer III, not the Panzer IV. The engines coughed once, then went silent. And somewhere beyond the frozen fields, invisible in the white fog, Soviet T-34 tanks were already coming to life. German tank crews did everything they could. They lit fires under engine compartments. They poured boiling water over frozen fuel lines. They cursed the cold, cursed Russia, cursed the war itself. Minutes passed, then hours. The sun rose slowly, revealing endless snowfields that stretched to the horizon like a frozen ocean. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was an enemy. Every second wasted meant the Soviets were getting closer, and they were moving in machines the Germans had never truly understood. Tanks that didn't fear snow, tanks that didn't fear ice, tanks designed not for comfort, but for survival. At the edge of a small forest, a Soviet tank crew prepared their T-34. The commander wiped frost from his periscope. The driver pressed the starter. The diesel engine roared to life almost instantly, shaking snow off the hull. No fire, no boiling water, no prayers, just raw, brutal engineering. The wide tracks dug into the snow, spreading the weight instead of sinking. Where German tanks were trapped like insects in ice, the T-34 moved forward, slow but unstoppable. The crew had not slept properly in days. Their uniforms were stiff with frost. But the tank was alive, and that was all that mattered.
German reconnaissance reports began to sound unreal. Enemy tanks advancing through deep snow. Movement detected where vehicles should not be able to pass. One officer wrote a sentence that would later become famous. Russian tanks move where a man can barely walk. At first, headquarters dismissed it as panic, an exaggeration, but soon the reports stacked up. Entire German units found their flanks exposed not by infantry, but by steel monsters emerging from frozen swamps and snow-covered fields once thought impassable. The winter was no longer neutral. It had chosen a side. The first clash came without warning. A German panzer unit finally managed to start several tanks and rolled forward, only to see dark shapes advancing through the snowfall. The silhouettes were unfamiliar. Sloped armor, wide tracks, low profile. The first shot bounced off the T-34's glasses plate at an impossible angle. The German gunner fired again, another ricochet. Then the Soviet tank answered. One shell, one hit. The panzer burned. In that moment, German crews realized something terrifying. This was not just a new tank. This was a new kind of war, and winter was its deadliest weapon. The German tank crews did not panic immediately. They were professionals, veterans of Poland and France, men who believed they had already mastered modern warfare. But Russia was teaching a different lesson. As temperatures dropped even further, the contrast became brutal. Soviet T-34s started their engines every morning like clockwork, while German tanks remained frozen statues. Fuel pumps cracked, lubricants failed, rubber seals shattered like glass. Crews were ordered to keep engines running all night, wasting precious fuel just to prevent freezing. Even then, many machines died in the dark. Meanwhile, the Soviet T-34's diesel engines kept working, louder, rougher, but alive. The first large-scale engagement shocked the German command. A panzer unit attempted to retreat across open ground, assuming deep snow would protect its flanks. It didn't. Soviet tanks appeared from directions marked impassable on German maps. Their wide tracks floated over snowdrifts, while German vehicles sank, spinning helplessly. One officer later wrote that his tank felt like it was being swallowed by the earth. The T-34s moved slowly, deliberately, like predators that knew their prey had nowhere to run. One by one, German tanks were hit from the sides, then from behind, their armor useless against angles they never expected to face. Inside the T-34, the conditions were brutal. There was no comfort, no insulation, no mercy from the cold. Metal surfaces burned the skin. Breath turned into frost on the walls. The crew shouted commands because the engine noise drowned everything else. But the tank did what it was built to do. Its sloped armor deflected shells that would have penetrated flat plates. Its gun punched through German armor at ranges once considered safe. The crew didn't feel like heroes. They felt tired, hungry, frozen. But every kilometer they advanced proved one truth. The machine was stronger than the winter, and that made all the difference. German reports grew darker with each passing day. Phrases like unexpected losses and enemy armor superiority began to appear. Officers complained that standard anti-tank guns were ineffective against the T-34 at typical combat ranges. Some units refused to engage unless they could attack from the rear or call in heavy artillery. Morale suffered. Soldiers who once laughed at the idea of Soviet resistance now avoided open terrain entirely. They feared the snow itself. Every white field could hide a moving gun. Every forest edge could conceal steel waiting to strike. By late December, the pattern was undeniable. Wherever the temperature dropped, Soviet armor became more aggressive. The cold was no longer slowing them, it was empowering them. German tanks that finally started often broke down after a few kilometers. Crews abandoned vehicles simply because they could not repair them in freezing winds. Soviet T-34 units, though suffering losses, kept moving, kept attacking, kept appearing where they should not have existed. The myth of German technical superiority was cracking, just like frozen steel under stress. And this was only the beginning. By the end of December 1941, German tank units were in chaos. Engines refused to turn, transmissions froze, and men suffered frostbite through gloves and uniforms. The landscape, blanketed in white, became a trap rather than a highway. Orders to advance were delayed, then ignored. Panzer crews watched in horror as Soviet T-34s, silent silhouettes against the snow, rolled over terrain deemed impassable, crushing the ground with wide tracks and relentless purpose. What should have been a tactical retreat for the Soviets became an advance. The Germans were losing not just vehicles, but the rhythm of war itself. Inside a T-34 moving through a narrow forest path, the commander's eyes scanned for movement. His crew worked like a single organism, hands and feet coordinated in perfect sequence despite freezing metal and biting wind. Every shot fired was precise, every maneuver intentional. The crew knew the enemy could be anywhere, behind a snowbank, hidden in a grove, or stuck in a ditch. And yet, each German tank that tried to move was a prize waiting to be claimed. The first shells hit, and the enemy's panic became visible. Smoke rose from immobilized vehicles. Soldiers scrambled, shouting in disbelief, some retreating before their tank could be destroyed. The T-34 advanced. German officers attempted to reorganize, to salvage what they could. Orders were shouted over frozen radios and howling wind. Some tanks finally managed to start, their engines coughing violently, barely moving. They attempted to coordinate attacks, but Soviet tanks had already crossed flanks and cut off retreat routes. Every maneuver by the Germans was anticipated, every gap exploited. Reports to headquarters described the battlefield as a landscape dominated by machines that the enemy should not have been able to bring here. Confusion, fear, and exhaustion spread like wildfire through units. Winter was no longer neutral, it was the weapon of the Soviets. In one small clearing, a German Panzer IV attempted to fire on a T-34 emerging from the trees. The shot hit the slope of the Soviet tank's armor and bounced harmlessly.
The T-34 responded in seconds. The round penetrated the Panzer's side. Flames erupted instantly. The crew barely had time to react. Nearby infantry froze, realizing they were exposed to more than one T-34. Every direction seemed to contain an invisible threat. By now, the German soldiers understood. Winter had created a battlefield where the Soviets' combination of engineering and daring made the impossible routine. The T-34 crews, however, were exhausted. Frost covered their faces and hands. Diesel engines heated the interior slightly, but not enough to thaw frozen bones. Each movement outside the tank was painful. Each command shouted from the turret was a battle against numbness. Yet, despite fatigue, hunger, and frostbite, they continued to push forward. Every kilometer gained was a victory not just over the enemy, but over nature itself. For the German troops, this was incomprehensible. How could men and machines survive where they were dying? The answer lay in simplicity. The T-34 was designed for this fight, and its crews were trained to endure. The sun barely rose over the snowy horizon, casting long shadows over a battlefield littered with immobilized German tanks. In the distance, the silhouettes of T-34s glided forward like predators in a frozen wasteland. Inside one of them, Sergeant Ivanov wiped frost from his goggles and peered through the sight. His hands were numb, his breath visible in the icy air. Every meter gained was a struggle. Yet the tank moved as if it were alive, crushing snow, ice, and despair in its path. Around him, his crew worked in perfect unison, feeding shells into the gun, adjusting engine throttle, navigating through terrain that had immobilized dozens of enemy vehicles.
German crews were demoralized. Entire units were immobilized in deep snow, engines frozen or dead, fuel lines cracked from the cold. The few tanks that could move were constantly harassed by T-34s that seemed to appear from nowhere. Reports began to describe the Soviet tanks almost like ghosts, appearing out of forests, striking and disappearing before reinforcements could respond. In one report, a panzer officer wrote, "We were frozen, trapped, and helpless. The snow itself became the enemy." Fear had taken root. Morale collapsed, and the T-34s pressed forward relentlessly. Back in the T-34, the crew felt both exhilaration and exhaustion. Each German tank destroyed was a mixture of triumph and survival instinct. Ivanov's driver navigated treacherous ground, while the loader handled shells with frost-bitten fingers. One round after another, Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs were knocked out, their crews abandoning tanks in terror. The snow muffled screams and gunfire, creating a surreal battlefield where death and silence intertwined. Every shot was deadly accurate, every movement calculated. This was no chaotic attack, it was warfare refined to its cold steel essence. By midday, German command was in crisis mode. They had underestimated the combination of winter, terrain, and Soviet engineering. Requests for reinforcements poured in, but the snow slowed even fresh units. The front lines fractured. Tanks that had survived the initial T-34 strikes were stranded by frozen rivers, impassable fields, and collapsing roads. Soviet commanders exploited every gap, every frozen embankment, every narrow pass. Reports noted that soldiers were retreating not just from enemy fire, but from terrain and climate itself. The battlefield was no longer just between men and machines. It was a war against the elements. Even as destruction raged, a strange bond formed between the T-34 crews and their machines. The tank was more than steel. It was life-saving armor, a mobile fortress, a weapon and shield all at once. Ivanov realized that the T-34's wide tracks and sloped armor were not just engineering marvels, they were symbols of survival. Where the Wehrmacht faltered, these machines triumphed. Each victory was as much against frost and snow as it was against enemy fire. By the end of the day, the Soviet tanks had carved a path through territory that the Germans had considered secure, leaving behind wreckage, confusion, and awe. As January 1942 approached, the Wehrmacht was in shock. Reports came in from every front. Tanks immobilized, infantry frozen, supply lines broken by snow and ice. Units that had prided themselves on precision and coordination were now scattered, reacting to threats that seemed impossible to predict. Soviet T-34s, despite frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion, continued to advance. Their crews had learned the terrain, mastered the snow, and exploited every mechanical weakness of the German machines. Where panzers bogged down or stalled, T-34s rolled unhindered, turning winter itself into a weapon of war. In one small forest clearing, Ivanov's T-34 found a cluster of Panzer IIIs and IVs attempting to regroup. The Germans fired blindly, hoping for luck. One shell glanced off the T-34's glasses plate, another ricocheted harmlessly. Then, in seconds, Ivanov's gunner fired. One panzer destroyed instantly, another disabled. German crews scrambled for cover, but the wide tracks of the T-34 prevented any counterattack. Snow, ice, and steel were now allies of the Soviet tank. The landscape that was supposed to slow them had become the perfect battlefield. By the end of the engagement, multiple German tanks were burning, and the remaining crews fled in panic. Back at German headquarters, officers struggled to comprehend the situation. Logistics were in collapse. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were delayed or destroyed. The once feared panzer divisions were now vulnerable, trapped in frozen fields, forests, and rivers. Even elite crews admitted in reports, "The Russian tanks move where men can barely walk. The cold, the terrain, and their engineering have turned the front against us." Morale sank. Commanders attempted desperate strategies, flanking maneuvers, concentrated artillery, air support, but winter, combined with the resilience of the T-34, rendered most plans futile.
Meanwhile, Ivanov and his crew pressed on. Their T-34 had become more than a machine. It was an extension of their survival instincts. Every meter gained, every German tank destroyed, reinforced the terrifying lesson. The Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable force it had seemed. The snow and ice, harsh and unrelenting, were companions to the Soviet advance. The crew could feel it. The battlefield itself had shifted allegiance. Each day, the T-34s pushed further, breaking through defensive lines, cutting off supply routes, and sowing chaos in enemy ranks. By the time the harshest weeks of winter passed, the result was undeniable. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered, not just by strategy or bravery, but by endurance, innovation, and the unforgiving Russian winter. The T-34 had proven itself as more than a tank. It was a force multiplier, a harbinger of doom for the Wehrmacht. Crews like Ivanov's emerged from the frost-bitten chaos, exhausted but alive, their machines battered yet operational. Reports to Moscow emphasized both the heroism of the crews and the technical superiority of their tanks. Winter had chosen its champion, and for the Germans, survival had become the only victory they could hope for. By February 1942, the front lines had stabilized, but the psychological damage to the Wehrmacht was permanent. Officers who had once believed in the invincibility of German tanks now wrote cautiously in their reports, often emphasizing the unbelievable mobility and resilience of Soviet T-34s. These tanks had transformed the frozen landscape into a deadly battlefield, where temperature, snow, and ice were as lethal as any weapon. Crews who survived winter campaigns carried scars that could not be healed, but they also carried pride. They had endured a trial that tested not only skill and courage, but the limits of human and mechanical endurance. The legend of the T-34 grew. Soldiers told stories in hushed tones about tanks moving through terrain impossible for panzers, striking with precision and disappearing into forests and snowdrifts. Each report from German survivors sounded eerily similar. "We fired, but they were already gone." It was as if the ground itself favored them.
Engineers and strategists took note, realizing that simple design choices, wide tracks, sloped armor, diesel engines had created machines capable of surviving and thriving where supposedly superior forces failed. The T-34 was more than a tank. It was an icon of resilience and adaptability. Ivanov and his crew returned from the winter campaign physically battered but triumphant. Their T-34, scarred with scratches, dents, and bullet holes, had survived while many Panzers had not. The crew had become intimately familiar with every lever, hatch, and surface of the tank. They had learned how to read the snow and ice, to anticipate German movements, and to use the environment as an ally. Each tank, each crew, each engagement became a story, a testament to human ingenuity combined with mechanical excellence. Their survival was proof that preparation, endurance, and understanding of the battlefield could turn even the harshest winter into an advantage. Historians looking back at the winter of 1941-1942 see it as a turning point. It was not only the resilience of Soviet troops, but also the innovation in tank design that made the difference. The T-34's ability to operate in conditions that immobilized German armor played a crucial role in slowing the advance of Operation Barbarossa. The winter campaigns forced Germany to rethink tactics, logistics, and even their expectations of technology. The lessons were brutal but clear. Nature could be weaponized, and human ingenuity had to adapt or perish. The winter left an enduring legacy. It proved that engineering, combined with courage and adaptation, could overcome overwhelming odds. The T-34 became a symbol not just of Soviet power, but of resilience in the face of adversity. Crews like Ivanov's embodied the struggle and triumph of men and machines working together against both human and environmental enemies. For the Wehrmacht, the lesson was unforgettable. The Russian winter was not a backdrop, it was a formidable opponent, and the T-34 its perfect champion.
Weeks after the initial winter battles, the landscape had transformed into a frozen graveyard. Burned-out German panzers protruded from the snow like tombstones, abandoned by crews who had fled the cold or been incapacitated by frostbite. Soviet T-34s moved silently across open fields and through dense forests, their wide tracks carrying them where no German vehicle could follow. Commander Ivanov's crew adjusted the periscopes, scanning for movement beneath the heavy snowfall. Every sound was amplified, the crunch of snow under armor, the faint hiss of steam from engines, the distant shout of German troops attempting to coordinate a counterattack. In this frozen chaos, survival depended on anticipation, precision, and sheer resilience. German tank crews were struggling to even see the battlefield. Frost covered vision ports, radios were unreliable in sub-zero temperatures, and engines barely turned over. Attempts to advance across snowdrifts resulted in vehicles stuck or destroyed. Meanwhile, Soviet reconnaissance reported enemy weaknesses and coordinated ambushes with deadly efficiency. From hidden positions in forests and ravines, T-34s emerged like ghosts, taking out stragglers with precise shots. One German officer would later write, "It was as if the snow itself moved against us, and the enemy was a phantom commanding it." The winter had become an invisible ally to the Soviets. Inside the T-34, the crew's morale was a mix of exhaustion and determination. Frost-bitten hands gripped cold steel levers as the driver maneuvered through fields that would have trapped any panzer. Every shot from the 76.2 millimeter gun was deliberate. Each destroyed tank or immobilized vehicle was proof of the machine's superiority and the crew's endurance. Ivanov's loader muttered under his breath, "This is not just a tank, it's our life." The diesel engine roared against the wind, and each meter gained was a small victory. Outside, snowstorms made the landscape surreal, white, silent, and deadly. Yet every maneuver reinforced a terrifying fact for the Germans. The T-34 could go where no human or machine thought possible. By late January, German forces began desperate attempts to counter the T-34 advance. Engineers tried to reinforce frozen roads and rivers, but the weight of vehicles caused ice to crack and collapse. Infantry patrols froze or surrendered when confronted with tanks appearing from seemingly impossible directions. Each failed attempt was reported back to headquarters with mounting panic. Supply lines crumbled under the combined assault of weather and Soviet firepower. German soldiers who prided themselves on discipline and precision now faced chaos. In letters and diaries, some simply wrote, "We are trapped by snow, cold, and steel. There is no escape."
The personal stories of the Soviet crews grew darker yet heroic. Ivanov's gunner, Petrov, had frostbite on his fingers but refused to remove gloves, fearing he might drop a shell mid-load. The driver, Sokolov, guided the T-34 over a frozen river, knowing that a miscalculation could mean sinking into ice and death. The tank's hull shuddered under the weight of snow and enemy fire, yet it remained operational. For every German tank destroyed, the Soviet crews experienced adrenaline, fear, and triumph simultaneously. Each victory against the freezing front lines was a testament not just to engineering, but to human endurance under conditions most would consider impossible. The morning was a blinding white, snowflakes swirling in the wind, masking the movements of both sides. Ivanov's T-34 crew paused behind a ridge, scanning the frozen valley below. Through the swirling snow, the faint silhouettes of German tanks appeared, trying to regroup and form a defensive line. The Soviets knew every meter of this terrain, hidden ravines, frozen rivers, and snowdrifts that could halt even the heaviest panzer. Ivanov signaled his crew. The diesel engine roared to life. The T-34 slid down the ridge, tracks gripping the icy slope, ready to strike the enemy before they even realized what was coming. The German crews, exhausted and demoralized, were unaware of the ambush forming. Their panzers trudged through snow, some stuck in frozen ditches. Commanders shouted orders, but frostbitten hands fumbled levers. Radios crackled with static, and the winter cold numbed nerves and reflexes. One officer later recalled, "We could see them, but they seemed to vanish into the white. We fired blindly, hoping to hit something, anything." Each German shot missed or ricocheted, while the Soviets' T-34 moved with precision, its wide tracks gliding over snowdrifts, and its gunner calculating each shot like a deadly chess move. The first shell hit a Panzer IV squarely in its side. Flames erupted instantly, smoke curling into the cold sky. Panic spread through the German line. Some crews abandoned their vehicles, others tried to reverse only to become stuck in snowdrifts. Ivanov's T-34 didn't stop. The crew targeted the next vehicle with deadly efficiency. Within minutes, multiple German tanks were destroyed or disabled. The valley that the Wehrmacht had considered safe was now a graveyard of steel and frozen soldiers. Outside, the snow muffled cries and explosions, creating a surreal scene, quiet, deadly, and unrelenting. Amid the chaos, the Soviet crews experienced the raw tension of survival. Petrov, the gunner, adjusted the aiming sights while frost burned his fingers. Sokolov, the driver, navigated treacherous ground with inches of clearance between tracks and hidden ice patches. Ivanov shouted orders, coordinating maneuvers while bullets ricocheted off the tank's sloped armor. Every second was life or death. The Germans tried to regroup, but the T-34s controlled every angle of attack. Winter, the silent ally, covered their movements. By the time reinforcements arrived, the German advance had been completely disrupted. When the smoke cleared, Ivanov's crews surveyed the aftermath, destroyed tanks, immobilized panzers, and abandoned equipment half buried in snow. They were exhausted, frozen, and hungry, yet alive. The ambush had succeeded because of skill, patience, and the design of their tank. Every victory reinforced a growing lesson for the Wehrmacht. The T-34 was not just a vehicle, it was a predator in winter, an unstoppable force where German machines could not operate. The snow had become a weapon in their hands, the frost a partner, and every meter gained was a testament to the resilience of man and machine working together against impossible odds.